In the Shafi'i school, if something is disliked, makruh, is it sinful to do? If something is disliked, if it is makruh, then is it sinful to do? This question relates to differences in Islamic legal theory, also known as usulul fiqh. Usulul fiqh is that discipline that teaches us the process of creating or developing sacred law. What Allah had given us is the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Those are our textual evidences. There are also other forms of evidence such as scholarly consensus and analogy, but those derive their strength or their authority based on the Quran. So essentially what we start off with is the Quran and the Sunnah. How do you get from the raw material, if I can call it that, of the Kalam of Allah and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and end up with fiqh? Do this, don't do that. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. This is permissible, this is impermissible. How did the scholars get from this point to that point? That process that they follow is what we learn about in the subject known as usulul fiqh or Islamic legal theory. That's a subject that deals with the raw materials. So it deals with Quran, it deals with Sunnah, it deals with ijma', scholarly consensus, it deals with qiyas or analogy. It also deals with the methodology employed by the independent jurist or the mujtahid. The independent jurist is the one who goes straight to the sources of the law and extrapolates from that the laws that we follow. So the processes that they follow, that is also dealt with in usul al-fiqh. And then finally, it also deals with the actual mujtahid, the qualifications of the mujtahid, the one who is able to independently derive law, as well as those who follow in the opinions of the mujtahid. This would roughly outline the subject of usulul fiqh, Islamic legal theory, and we have many courses available on seekersguidance.org that you could register for free and learn about usulul fiqh or Islamic legal theory. One such course is an ongoing, it's a level 3 course in Shafi'i usulul fiqh, which is called Lub al-Usul. It's based on Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari's text in Islamic legal theory. He also wrote the exegesis or the sharh of that particular text called Ghayatul Wusul. So that's an ongoing course that we have. However, we also have concurrent second level courses on Islamic legal theory in the Shafi'i school, such as Al-Waraqat, Imam al-Haramain's Al-Waraqat, which is taught by Sheikh Muhammad Ka, also available for free on seekersguidance.org. So that subject will give us the length and breadth of this particular process that I've just explained of Islamic legal theory. Now, why did I mention that as an intro? Because in this particular science, in this discipline, right at the beginning, there are many introductory discussions around the concept of a hukm, of a legal verdict, that something is halal or haram at the surface level, or whether something is haram, makruh, permissible, mubah, or mustahab, mandub, or sunnah, which all are synonyms for that which is recommended. And then finally, fard or wajib, that which is obligatory. Under this particular discussion of the various legal verdicts or laws in Arabic ahkam, therein you will find that scholars have differed as to how many categories of the hukm are there. For the Shafi'i school, there are two types of hukm. Firstly, you have your hukm wada'i and you have your hukm taklifi. What we are discussing is the hukm taklifi, the laws pertaining to the actions of the duty bound, you and I, what we must do, what we should not do, what we should do, what is permissible for us to do, etc. For the Shafi'i school, when it comes to haram and makruh, there are only two categories. There is that which is prohibited, and that is called haram, the definition of which is ما يعاقب فاعله ويثاب تاركه. That action wherein if you do it, you are liable for punishment, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are liable for retribution. But if you abstain from it for the sake of Allah, you are going to be rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's take an obvious example, zina. A person who commits zina is liable for punishment by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But a person who deliberately refrains from committing zina, deliberately avoids committing zina for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, obviously now this means the person was in a situation wherein zina was a possibility and they stepped away, they walked away for the sake of Allah. Such a person will be rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for doing that. So that is the definition of the word haram, of the hukm that is considered haram. As for disliked actions or makruh, literally it comes from the word kariha yakrahu, which means to dislike. Makruh is that which is disliked, meaning that Allah is displeased with this particular action. The definition, the legal theory definition or usulul fiqh definition of makruh is ما لا يعاقب فاعله ويثاب تاركه. It is that which the person who does the action will not be liable for punishment by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yet the person who deliberately omits or leaves off the action or abstains from the action, he or she will be rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, that means, as opposed to the haram, if you do it, haram if you do it, then you are liable for punishment. Makruh, if you do it, you are not liable for punishment. Hence, from the definition alone, we can ascertain that the makruh action, a person who perpetrates a makruh action, has not been sinful, will not be liable for punishment by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, if they avoid the action, they will be rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this strikes the balance for anyone thinking that if you learn this definition, you may be prone to committing that which is makruh simply because you will not be punished for it. It would be an imbalanced view of makruh if you only focus on that component, because the other component is also important. That if you abstain from a makruh action, if you deliberately omit a makruh action, for the sake of Allah, Allah will reward you for that action. And in this we find our balance. Now these are Shafi'i definitions. The Hanafi definitions are slightly different in that they, number one, have subdivisions of makruh and their definitions would differ slightly accordingly. So for those who follow the Hanafi school, you have a category called makruh. Beneath that you have makruh tahrimi and makruh tanzihi. Makruh tahrimi is that which is disliked, but disliked to the extent that you would be punishable for it. In other words, it is sinful. And makruh tanzihi is sort of lightly disliked in that you will not be liable for punishment. You will not be considered sinful for doing that. These categories exist in the Hanafi school, but they don't exist in the Shafi'i school. There is, I'm not even going to mention it, there's one particular issue in fiqh in which you may get the impression that the Shafi'is also have a concept of makruh tahrimi and makruh tanzihi, but that is not actually a standard definition. It is like an exception to the rule in relation to Shafi'i fiqh. So we won't get into that to avoid confusion bi'idhnillah ta'ala. In summary, once again, a person who commits that which is makruh is not sinful. A person who commits that which is makruh, according to the Shafi'i school, is not sinful. He will not be liable for punishment by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, a person who omits, in other words, does not do, in other words, avoids that which is makruh, will be rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if they did it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What do we mean if they did it for the sake of Allah? Let's say a person is prevented from doing something makruh. So they wanted to do that which is makruh, but they were stopped. They were coerced into leaving that off. Then they would not be not liable, but they would not be at the benefit of actually attaining the reward for leaving it off. As an example, to stand and drink is considered makruh. It is considered disliked in the Shafi'i school. So if you are about to stand and drink, and you wanted to stand and drink, but then you had a cramp in your leg and you sat down, and the only reason you sat down was because of the cramp in your leg, then you didn't sit and drink for the sake of Allah. You sat and you drank because of the cramp in your leg. So you were kind of prevented from that makruh action. In that sense, it is the person who leaves it off for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the reason I'm taking time to explain this particular definition is that the differences in the schools of thought and the application of makruh is, while semantical on the one level, it also creates some confusion for people on the other level. So if somebody is accustomed to hearing the Hanafi definition of makruh, then they may become easily confused. But to simplify the matter, makruh tahrimi for the Shafi'is is basically haram. Right? Makruh tahrimi for the Shafi'is is what we would refer to as haram. So in that sense, keep it simple and understand that our job as the mukallaf, as the duty bound, is to do that which is wajib or fard, which by the way is the same thing in the Shafi'i school, and to do as much of the sunnah as we can, especially that which is emphasized and that which we can be consistent with. Then to avoid at all costs that which is haram, and to try as best as possible to avoid that which is makruh as well. But should we do that which is makruh, it would not result in any punishment or sin, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah.